Without further ado, we'll make a start then. It gives me and everyone very great pleasure to have an ideas and influence panel, and to have yourself and Tim, people who are actually at the cutting edge, practitioners, talking to us about bookselling and its repercussions. So Gail is a very well-known and very well-published author who's worked in radical feminist and small press book trade since 1973. I think you deserve a medal, Gail. It's wonderful. She researches in 20th and 21st century book history. I'm not going to read any more of her biography because we're working to time, and it's an equal pleasure to have Tim with us, who has come the furthest of anybody, I think, for this conference. Co-owner of Books for Cooks, a specialist culinary, new and antiquaries bookstore in Melbourne and Australia. We'll gloss over that you were a former lawyer. You've now come from the dark side. That's good. Absolutely. And you'll be able to see that Tim is board member of some very key and important booksellers associations, about which I'm sure he'll be happy to talk over chats later or online. So without further ado, I think Gail is first in the proceedings. So Gail, off you go.
Right, okay, so I'm going to be talking today about the dissemination of radical literature in Britain since 1960, bookshops, distributors and book fairs. And I haven't got a PowerPoint for various complicated reasons, but I did think my two favourite items that I would have put into a PowerPoint, I'm just going to hold up to my screen, which I hope you can see, because I feel that they epitomise a lot about the kind of contradictions and difficulties that we have to deal with. So the first one is the cover of a magazine I worked on, which is actually what brought me into radical publishing, called Women's Report. And we had a special feature in 1974 about feminists in print and radical distribution. And I don't think you can actually see that because the print is very small, but it's basically about all the many different things that a woman has to do in order, including doing her washing and her shopping, in order to produce her feminist publications. And then the other thing that I'll just show you quickly, although my talk is not by any means only about anarchist distribution, this is a sticker from Active Distribution, which is an anarchist book distributor in Britain. And as you can see, the poor people have worn themselves out cycling around town delivering their books. So that was, I just thought that was amusing. It only occurred to me later on when I was doing this. Okay, so to my talk. The distribution and dissemination of print publications is a challenge for the whole book trade. But the radical and alternative book trade has found the challenges more daunting because of its lack of financial resources and the mainstream trade's general lack of enthusiasm for its content. And in this talk, I'm talking about radical left rather than radical right. While the radical book trade occupies a relatively small niche within the mainstream book trade, the difficulties it encounters and the measures it's taken to overcome them provide interesting lessons on adapting to prevailing social and economic conditions while remaining true to your market or your audience, let's say. What the radical book trade has lacked in resources, it makes up for in resourcefulness, utilising many methods of dissemination apart from the formal book trade, especially the intersecting networks of activists and organisations which create a more direct relationship with their potential audience than those of the mainstream book trade. I'm going to stop that stupid noise as well. Sorry about this. Okay. Where was I? Yes. So the part of its resourcefulness comes from the intersecting networks of activists and organisations which create a more direct relationship with their potential audience than those of the mainstream book trade. And it doesn't produce its output in a vacuum separate from its other cultural and political activities. This is a major factor which enables the successful production and dissemination of radical and alternative literature on a restricted budget. So I'm going to talk first of all about radical bookshops, which is obviously the most visible point of dissemination, at least to the public. In Britain, the radical book trade can be traced back to at least the late 18th century, though there were, amongst others, John Gough, heretical bookseller, in the 16th century. But the radical book trade's modern growth started in the 1960s when the first alternative bookshops opened, most individually owned, starting with the Paperback Bookshop in Edinburgh in 1959. There was an upsurge in alternative bookshops in the 1970s and 80s, mostly run by collectives, and in 1975, some 15 of them, none of which had existed before 1971, set up the Federation of Alternative Bookshops, though the organisers changed their name to the Federation of Radical Bookshops in 1980 to accommodate other types of radical bookshops, such as those of political parties, some of which have been running since the 1930s. The number of FRB members increased to around 50 in 1982, with a peak of over 100 in the late 1980s. After this, numbers declined fairly rapidly, reaching a nadir of 8 in the early 2000s. However, the renaissance of the radical book trade was marked in 2011 with the launch of the Alliance of Radical Booksellers, ARB, with 17 members, including some distributors and online businesses. And today it has 47 members, 2 of which joined in the last month. These trends are encouraging when so many independent bookshops have been forced to close. And I'm still working out how this fits in with the trends that Merrill Halls was talking about yesterday. 2 of the earliest radical bookshops of recent times were the Black Bookshops, New Beacon Books in North London, founded in 1966, and Bogle Louverture, founded in West London in 1968. Both were also publishers of significant works of fiction and non-fiction. Unlike the mainstream book trade, however, their work was always done in the context of intense commitment to Black radical politics. They wanted, in the words of John LaRose, one of New Beacon's founders, to provide, open quotes, an independent validation of one's own culture, history, and politics, a sense of self, a break with discontinuity, end quote. Now, being amongst the most visible parts of the radical community has caused bookshops many difficulties, going back at least to the suffragettes, because of our enemies recognizing their importance for encouraging community cohesion. So, for example, in 1977, Bookshop Joint Action was founded to respond to a significant increase in racist attacks on Black and radical shops. For example, Walter Rodney Bookshop, that was Bogle Louverture, alone experienced 11 attacks between 1977 and 1984, while Houseman's Peace Bookshop in King's Cross, London, has experienced a number of special branch raids, a letter bomb attack, and other problems, including a libel action for stocking anti-fascist magazines. That was also, Bookmarks was also in that libel case. And in 1984, Customs and Excise officers raided London's Gay the Word bookshop and its directors' homes, seizing all their imported books and retaining thousands of others at the point of entry. Now, I've got no time to go into this now, but there's 2 books of great relevance which have been published recently, one about second-hand bookshops in Britain, and the other which analyses what we mean by a, quote, good bookshop. In the author's opinion, this is not one which sells merchandise. So much for radical bookshops and how they're supposed to survive, and also for ideological reasons they stock other items. And also, I've got no time to go into now the role of libraries and librarians as disseminators of radical literature. Now, New Beacon Books was possibly the first radical bookshop to implement a full e-commerce site as early as 2000, probably because mail order, both national and international, was always at least as significant to their business as their retail trade. Unfortunately, it looked like they were going to have to close very recently, but there's been a magnificent response of a crowdfunder. So we're hoping, everybody's hoping that they will survive as our first black bookshop in this country. Other radical bookshops whose business has traditionally been more locally based generally have developed their web presence later. Of course, many of them did it in response to the pandemic. Houseman's adopted its web shop quite early in 2010, having recognised before most of the trade the potential damage that could be inflicted by Amazon, and its website was amongst was possibly the first to expose the problems with Amazon, not just around the book trade, but because of its employment practices and so on. So now we move on to distributors. And it has been the existence of a number of radical distributors which has enabled the shops to flourish and to gain relatively easy access to a range of material in their specialist areas. Probably the best known of these distributors was the Publications Distribution Cooperative, PDC, whose existence between 1976 and 1984 contributed substantially to the growth of radical bookshops in the 1970s and 80s and their subsequent decline. PDC's initial concern was with distributing magazines and pamphlets, but to increase profit margins, it soon started wholesaling books from small radical publishers, starting with Allison and Busby. PDC was a powerful catalyst for growth in the radical book trade, as shops, stalls and groups running occasional events could easily obtain a range of stock from one source, while publishers knew there would be a reliable market for their output. But its attempts to be all things to all radical publications was always likely to require ongoing external support, the lack of which was probably the main cause of its eventual collapse. And we can compare this with Impress, a literary distributor which started in 2002 and is still going. But it would have been extremely hard for it to continue without support from Arts Council England. PDC, part of its rationale, well, maybe most of its rationale initially, but anyway, it hoped to circumvent W.H. Smith's stranglehold on the retail news trade by establishing a distribution network under radical control, which could supply mainstream bookshops and newsagents, as well as radical outlets. Smith had consistently refused to sell radical literature. For example, back in spring 1941, despite protests from retailers, they stopped selling Labour Research, which had somehow evaded the ban during its first 20 years. The magazine survived because thousands of readers helped to get it into shops. And in its self-appointed role of defending, quotes, family values, right up to the 1980s and 90s, Smith also refused to handle not only gay news, but also Private Eye, which did not sit well with its insistence on distributing girly mags, which small news agents were forced to handle by the terms of their contract. So, as I said, distributing the periodicals and self-published pamphlets in which the radical book trade specialises is very onerous. Organising their timely distribution is particularly costly. So taking on this arduous task definitely contributed majorly to PDC's demise. However, a new distributor turnaround, which started as a workers' co-op, sort of to replace PDC, although it later developed a conventional business model, took on some of PDC's business And a condition of being given a startup grant was that they took no periodicals and hardly any pamphlets. Yes, okay. PDC's main customers remained radical bookshops, along with whole food shops and community organisations, despite their attempts to break into the news trade. But this alternative scene was not the only group concerned about the lack of distribution for left-wing ideas. In 1989 and 90, the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom, an organisation backed substantially by trade unions, worked on a report about how to overcome the stranglehold on distribution, not only of W.H. Smith and Menzies as wholesalers, but also of Murdoch and Maxwell, as they manoeuvred newspaper distribution off the railways and onto the road, thus separating the distribution of newspapers and magazines, much to the detriment of the latter. And I'm not talking there particularly about radical publications. I'm just, talking about mainstream magazines, which were distributed by rail previously. In the deliberations of the CPBF, books were rather neglected when thinking about distribution issues. But an interesting example of circumventing both the monopoly of W.H. Smith and breaking down resistance to local newsagents stocking books and pamphlets was the experience of Centerprise, which started in 1971 in then very untrendy Hackney. In 1973, this is where I live, by the way, still. In 1973, Centerprise decided to make local publishing an integral part of its work, and between March 1976 and February 1977, they sold 6,922 copies, that is a staggering quantity, of their local history titles in Hackney alone, partly by selling them through 20 local newsagents. A further attempt to tackle the issue of radical magazine distribution was launched in the early 2000s by Inc., the independent news collective. It was run by someone with experience of distributing ethical coffee, and though Inc. was reasonably successful at raising the profile and increasing the subscription of their 80-plus member magazines, mainly through the distribution of thousands of well-designed and colourful leaflets, they did no better at reaching into newsagents than previous attempts had. Apart from PDC and Turnaround, which still exists today and is very successful, there have been a number of other significant radical distributors. Central Books started in the 1930s with a Communist Party focus, and it too has survived, broadening its focus and being the main distributor of highly selected periodicals as well as books and pamphlets. Other distributors include Third World Publications, deceased unfortunately, Airlift, likewise deceased, Active Distribution, as I showed you there, AK Press, the African Book Collective, Bookspeed, each supplying its own speciality to bookshops as well as individual mail order, especially since COVID. There are also dozens of small distros of DIY material which have come and gone since the 1990s, including several devoted to zines on sexual politics and black politics. Such informal distros which specialise in distributing magazines to individuals and on stalls at zine fairs are designed to get these most ephemeral and often free publications to their intended audiences easily, but often in return for sending some stamped addressed envelopes. This is even true in these days of the internet and social media. There's much more that could be said about that as well. There was never a successful feminist distributor, unlike in Germany and the US, for example, probably because almost all UK radical bookshops and distributors had significant feminist sections. There was an attempt to set one up in 1974, spearheaded by Feminist Books, a small publisher in Leeds. They were motivated by the same frustration as every other small publisher who's tried to get something going, but unfortunately they could not raise enough funds to sustain themselves. And again, I can't go into this here, but I will mention that there was quite a small but successful feminist, or two, in fact, separate ones, feminist book bus initiatives, which toured small communities. And the Women's Press ran a book club, which, raises up many of the general questions about book clubs versus retail and so on, which I'm sure a lot of you know about. So finally, book fairs. The very act of cultural celebration is often in itself political, particularly when previously silenced members of an excluded group, such as Irish people or survivors of the mental health system, make their presence felt. And the most public manifestation of such intersecting concerns in the radical book trade has been its book fairs, where readers and publishers, authors and disseminators can come together. Foundational were the socialist book fairs, run from 1978 by Bookmarks, the Socialist Worker Party bookshop. Their great innovation was to present together radical titles from all publishers, mainstream and radical. They attracted criticism for being entirely commercial, but helped inspire the anarchist book fairs, the international feminist book fairs, the international radical Black and Third World book fairs, and since 2013, the radical book fairs, each with their own philosophies, though with the shared aim of engaging a wide readership with radical ideas. The first anarchist book fair started modestly in London in 1983 by a small group of anarchist distributors and bookshop workers disaffected by the lack of political discussion at the socialist book fairs, and they grew steadily. As it grew, it developed an expanding program of events, and by 2014, the London Anarchist Book Fair attracted well over 3,000 people. And before the pandemic, around 50 anarchist book fairs were held in Britain and worldwide, some being cultural festivals lasting several days. And again, they stopped, but are now starting to come back after COVID. Unfortunately, the London Anarchist Book Fair imploded in 2017 for reasons too complicated to go into now. But from last year, a more modest anarchist book fair in London has returned and is in fact happening this coming weekend, joining forces with the Anti-University to present, quotes, a week-long festival of radical learning, mutual education and printed resistance. International radical Black and Third World book fairs were organised between 1982 and 1995 in London, with smaller offshoots in Bradford and Manchester. They were instigated and run by New Beacon Books, Bogle Louverture Books and the Race Today Collective to extend the work of the Caribbean artist movement and to cater for an audience ignored by the literary establishment. From the outset, they deliberately combined social and political analysis and celebrated Black culture in all its forms. It was notable how many working class people attended these book fairs and how many tiny publishers came from around the world at their own expense. The first International Feminist Book Fair was held in London in 1984, with a regional book week held simultaneously in 27 towns and cities in Britain and Ireland. Its organisers were also aware of their community, organising many book-related events in London and facilitating the events elsewhere. They nevertheless alienated many within the radical book trade by striking a deal with W.H. Smith for their stores to carry promotional material, even where there was a local radical bookshop organising events. Feminist Book Fortnight, which came out of the Regional Book Week, continued annually around Britain as a commercial promotion until the early 1990s, and subsequent international book fairs were held every 2 years in Norway, Canada, Spain, the Netherlands, and Australia until 1994. Feminist Book Fortnight was revived in 2018, and a small press day was launched in 2016, both suspended during the pandemic, and both of them with the same spirit of bringing, reaching out to bookshops in the small press day case to bring small comics and zine self-publishers to wider attention. By the mid-1990s, all the radical book fairs, apart from the ever-expanding anarchist book fairs, had died, and the radical book trade generally appeared to be in serious decline. In an attempt at revival, however, the Alliance of Radical Booksellers organised the first London Radical Book Fair in 2013, and in 2014 teamed up with Alternative Press, a group dedicated to showcasing the depth and breadth of the UK small press scene, rather similar to those materials from the Small Press Day. Thus, the Radical Book Fair brought together not just books and pamphlets, but also self-published comics, zines, art books and prints, whether from photocopier or printing house, to show the full diversity of radical and alternative publications today.
Gail, you've got 1 minute left. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, well, this is my last sentence, you'll be happy to know. Not all the alternative press publishers would see themselves as overtly political, but each would identify as part of a self-publishing movement alternative to the mainstream. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Much appreciated. Perfect timing. Okay, we'll move on now to Tim, who is going to be our second speaker.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. I've very much enjoyed the fascinating papers over the last 2 days, and I'm very flattered to be presenting in what I think is really august company, because talking about books is what makes my day, makes my life, and to be talking about books seriously is even better. Unfortunately, I'm not an academic at all. I am a bookseller, a career bookseller with some 23 years experience, and I am not even a general bookseller. I'm a specialist, and I curate my stock from about 4% of non-fiction, which means I don't sell fiction and I don't sell children's books, which are about 70 to 80% of the new book market. There's no Dan Brown, no Harry Potter, and about half our sales are secondhand, vintage or antiquarian. So with that, you'll have read that I've been on a few boards, and I must state that the opinions and conclusions that I state today are mine and not those of the ABA in Australia or ANZAB, the Antiquarian Board. I'm full of opinion and I'm happy to discuss them with you, but please don't blame the ABA for what I'm about to say. I should note that I found quite a few parallels between what Meryl said yesterday and what Andrew said today about the Japanese book market with what I was planning to say today. So I am skating between some of the things that I'm saying, and hopefully I'll be able to shed some differences, shed some light on some differences in the international book trade, rather than cover similar ground. So when I proposed this paper, I thought it would be really easy to write a chronological narrative of what happened over the last 10 years. It's not that easy. This was the period I was on the board at the ABA, and we lived these issues daily. It was a very complex time, but it's not a simple task to separate them out, because every time we thought we dealt with one issue or had a strategy for responding to something else popped up. It was like a giant game of whack-a-mole in a public government orientated sort of space where we're negotiating or attempting to negotiate with government, responding and supporting bookstores, dealing with publishers, trying to treat with international issues around copyright. It's tightly interwoven, and for much of it, there wasn't really a magic answer. Our strategy was pretty much get to the end of the day and deal with the next day. The other thing is that in preparing for this, it really became apparent that there is little or no data about much of the Australian book trade that is owned by booksellers. Nielsen Book Data is about the only person who measures the Australian book market. The Australian government's ABS stopped recording statistics on the Australian book trade almost 20 years ago. And the small amount of information that's available from government analysis or even the industry is just really irrelevant given the speed of change and the number of issues that popped up. So I should also say in starting that when I was accepted that I would say something, I thought, oh, I better learn something about doing a 20-minute presentation. And the TED Talk people said, make sure you have one message. Reinforce that message over and over again. I thought slides, and then I thought, no, that's not going to work. I'm just going to tell you the message up front and then get into the detail. And if we run out of time, I'm happy to rabbit on about bookselling in Australia for as long as people would like to listen. But the message to you today is that bookselling in all its guises, new, antiquarian, secondhand, thrift, charitable, radical, in all is alive. It's well and it's growing again in Australia. But our lived experience in the last decade is that it's in a state of flux. There's constant change, and bookselling skills need to evolve no matter which channel you're in. Bookstores that neither change nor respond to change will eventually close. We are seeing that slowly happen. Booksellers should not be static. That's not to say you need to change because someone else is doing something different, but you need to consider that and decide whether what you're doing is right for your community and your customers. Booksellers face many challenges, but they are not insurmountable. I think we've heard from several presenters over the weekend that bookselling is alive, it is resilient, that significant disasters can be overcome, and overcome with what in hindsight seems remarkable ease, and that we get back to a situation where bookselling is vibrant and alive. Now, a few things about the Australian market. We're a young market. Australia was established just over 200 years ago, and our first bookstore is from 1844. Our first chain, Angus and Robertson, remember that name, was in 1874. But by the 1880s, we had the world's largest bookstore in Melbourne because of the gold rushes. E.W. Cole, a completely mad bookseller, had a bookstore that rambled over 3 city blocks, over 1 million titles in stock at the end of the world. He lasted until the 1920s. Until the 1980s, most book supply was from the UK. Even today, copyright sales are often British Commonwealth rights rather than Australian. So Australian copyright is seen as a subset of British Commonwealth rights, and a significant number of books are imported either wholesale or retail. Our main publishers are mostly international: Penguin Random House, HarperCollins, Hachette, Macmillan, Simon & Schuster. You know the list. We do have a vibrant local publishing industry that has flourished since the 1980s. There's a reason for that. I'll come to that a little bit later. But Text, Scribe, Black Ink, UQP, people in the UK would probably know Hardy Grant. The name Allen & Unwin is now an Australian-owned publisher, to name a few. This publishing is predominantly in the area of literary fiction, lifestyle, and general fiction of the less pulp or trashy, I suppose you would say. And it tends to be dominated by publishing in paperback in what's called in Australia a trade paperback format, which is an alternative to hardcover. Hardcovers are not shipped or produced in Australia because of the sheer weight and cost. But it does allow the Australian trade to have an interesting price point halfway between a paperback and a hardcover, but not much more in the cost of production. So there's a bit more fat for the publisher and a bit more fat to share with the bookseller. We have only 3 main distribution sheds representing most of the publishers: UBD, owned by Penguin Random House, ADS, owned by Hachette, and Heads owned by HarperCollins. And each shed represents about 1/3 of the publishers available in Australia. We have no wholesalers such as Ingram or Gardners. Never had and probably never will. The market is just not big enough. We're too far away, and the issue of size of the market and size of the country get in the way. Consumption tax. Well, you call it VAT, but at least you're 0 rated here. We call it GST, and it's levied on just about everything, and it's 10% on books. So our books are instantly 10% more expensive over the counter. And if you're aware of the book depository model, you'll appreciate that that gives them an instant 10% advantage. We have 2 main printers who can print non-illustrated, mostly paperbacks. All full colour illustrated books are printed offshore and shipped in, sometimes drop shipped from China, but if anyone's been following current shipping and publishing delivery trends at the moment, shipping anywhere is a nightmare. But most often now it's shipped to the UK and the US and then broken up and distributed based on which territory or puts their hand up for what sort of stock. Shipping from the UK by sea is 14 weeks. From New York, it's 16 weeks. And if the Panama Canal is closed, it's just not happening. Wages, rents and educational levels of customers are quite high by international standards, which means that we should have a great audience, but we do have, as booksellers, high costs. Australia is highly urbanised. I can't stress this enough. 86% of people live in cities of more than 100,000. If you add up the major 3 cities, that's almost 60% of our population. Melbourne has almost 6 million people. It doesn't sound much when you compare it, but there's only 26 million people in Australia. And Australia is something like 27 times the size of the UK. Or we're the same size as the US and we have about 8% of the population. That makes distribution a real problem. Most cities under 100,000 don't have a bookshop. And if they do, they only have one. The Australian dollar is volatile and is a carry trade currency because we sell a lot of dirt and it's sold to China around the world. It means that the dollar is a floating currency and it can vary up to 10% within a week. It means that imports, particularly over a 14 or 16 week period, can be really tricky. Australia is a really, really big place and there's not a lot of people in it and we are all along one edge. Distribution is a significant challenge. Shipping by road from Sydney to Perth in Western Australia takes over a week. The last couple of months, it's been 2 weeks, and during the lockdowns during the pandemic, it couldn't happen because the borders were closed. We had most of our state borders were closed. Melbourne to Queensland can take 4 weeks when it's not raining. When it's raining, it's just not happening. The monsoons come in and that part of the country closes down. Currently, we're in a La Nina and the East Coast is getting something like 4 times the amount of rain they would normally get in a year. And so distribution is again grinding to a halt. So tyranny of distance is perhaps our market's biggest indicator. It's our biggest problem. And paradoxically, it's actually one of our best insulating factors, because if you're not in Australia selling and distributing books, you're trying to do it from outside, it's really hard and it's really expensive, particularly if you don't have local assets. So according to Nielsen Bookscan, our main channels are independents, and they say 10%. I would say about 28 to 32%. Chains 24%, and I would say that floats a little bit. And the distinction between those numbers is that the bean counters at Nielsen say that chains represent people who have multiple stores. We say independents are those who are members of the Australian Booksellers Association and have single ownership or non-public ownership. Our chain businesses are often, both of them, Dymocks and Collins, are both franchise models, which is quite different and unusual. I don't think there's any in the UK. What that means is that they have a core of corporate stores that are owned by the head office, and then probably 70 to 80% of their network of stores, commonly branded, are franchisees. These are often people who've taken a bronze handshake from at 50 from a white-collar job and decided that running a bookstore is a really nice idea because you sit around and read books, you don't have to do much. And it's a franchise because the franchisee will do everything for you. Trouble is the franchise fees are about 14% of turnover, quite high. Direct department store channel is about 20 to 28% of the market, and it's all pretty much at the bottom end. The fancy stores tried to have bookstores, but they just don't. It's the Asda's, Tesco type sell front list disposable fiction that they move through. They sell volume, but they don't generate huge value. Products sold in one channel are often not sold in another. We are almost silos between the DDSs and the indies. If you look at the top 10 books, they're quite different. Bookstores what the public consider real bookstores are what we describe as our independents. They tend to be single owners and single stores in single towns. They sell a much higher proportion of literary fiction, specialist non-fiction, higher end lifestyle and children's, and they rarely discount. Chains with centralised buying buy a lot of middle market books and are an index bookstore. There was always a top 100 books at the front, and it's based on the Bookscan numbers, and it's sort of a self-referencing, self-fulfilling business model. If you're listed as number one, it will be number one. Now, today I'm going to be mostly talking about independent and chain stores because they are the people who make up the membership predominantly of the ABA. They're the bookstores that I have dealt with. I will discuss second-hand and antiquarian booksellers. They are members of our of the association as well. At the end, if I have not written too much and I run out of things to say. But that's enough of introduction. Today's story is really about Nick Sherry, or what he said in 2011. Senator Sherry was a Labor minister. He was a senior minister in the Labor government that had been returned with much excitement under Kevin Rudd as doing great things. It was going to be the next big social experiment in Australia. That all sort of went south very, very quickly. He was the Assistant Treasurer. He was the Minister for Small Business. He was a small businessman himself. And at a public conference, he said, I think in 5 years, other than a few specialist booksellers in capital cities, we will not see a bookstore. They will cease to exist. This was unprompted. Such a sweeping statement might be taken with a grain of salt because it's from a politician. But in this case, it inflamed and outraged the entire arts community. It was picked up in every paper. It was picked up in papers around the world. Booksellers, publishers, readers, authors, all jumped on social media, all wrote to newspapers. Newspapers gave extreme column inches to the issue. For many booksellers, that outrage was coupled with a real sense of existential crisis because we were thinking, I'm not feeling comfortable about where my business is. There are all these other issues on the horizon, and a senior government minister has come out and said that to us. So would bookstores survive? Was bookselling a viable industry? Were real questions at the time. Now, he was widely ridiculed and condemned for the comment, but he didn't retract it. The extraordinary thing was that it actually, I think, did a lot of good for the Australian industry. The traditional commercial tension between booksellers and publishers. Booksellers are asking for margin, always want to give books back. Publishers saying, no, we want to keep the money, go away. That all disappeared. All of a sudden it's us and them. We have got to convince the public and the government that bookselling is a viable industry and that publishing cultural material in Australia is important. It needs support, it needs to be sustained, and we need to work together. And it meant that the entire industry, whether you're small, big, independent, specialist, general, secondhand, well, it didn't really affect them, but they jumped on board too. The Author Society, the Librarians Association, the Publishers Association, the Copyright Council, all jumped on board and roundly condemned the government. Those four major associations now meet on a regular basis every 3 or 4 months as an informal book council, which is an extraordinary result given that for 50 years we've been trying to get a book council in Australia and we've never had one. We got one informally because a politician said something he couldn't defend. So why did he say it? Well, to be honest, I don't think anyone really knows. He's never said why it was such an important thing to do. He very quickly hid behind an awkward laugh on social media, and the suggestion that he was sparking debate and invigorating the book industry by doing so was about the only defence he put forward. So let's set the scene and see whether there's some real reasons why it was going on. With hindsight, we know that in 2010, that was the high watermark for print sales for the Australian new book industry. For the previous decade and more, sales had grown year on year. We had seen a continuation of what was considered the golden decade of Australian book selling from 1990 to 2000, just continue on. And by 2010, we were seeing annualised growth of 10 to 12 to 15%. Bookstores had never had it so easy. The Australian book market, as measured by Nielsen Bookscan, had increased from 0.8 billion in 2003 to almost 1.4 billion in 2010. Some commentators say it had even reached 1.6 billion because Nielsen don't necessarily measure the whole market. This was notwithstanding the global financial crisis in 2008. And some would say because of it, because the Australian government at the time gave a lot of support and stimulus to the Australian economy from 2008 to 2010. So we were still surfing that wave of cash in the community and the economy. But in 2011, things changed and Borders collapsed in the US. Its offshore subsidiaries quickly followed suit. Now, in Australia, a few years earlier, Borders had been sold to a centuries-old book chain, Angus and Robertson, our first and oldest book chain. Angus and Robertson by then had become Angus and Robertson Whitcoulls, and they'd taken over the major bookseller chain in New Zealand, creating a thing called the Red Group. And they represented perhaps 25% of the Australian and New Zealand book industry by volume, by value, and by the number of bookstores. Angus and Robertson was a trusted heritage brand. It was also a publisher. The publishing imprint had published some of Australia's greatest known poets and authors from the 1880s onwards. They were in most shopping centres and they were pretty much in every major country town. And when Borders had arrived in Australia as the first and last big box book retailer that we'd ever seen, offering a range of books that we'd never seen, Red Group decided to get into business and buy that as the final part of their group. They were seduced by the big box retail ideas that were coming out of the UK in particular. 5 minutes, wow. I've got 27 slides. That's going to be trouble. I'm going to try and shorten this up a bit. So Red Group failed. And the reason it failed is it just was bad business. It wasn't because they didn't have books. It wasn't because they didn't have places to sell books. They were just really bad at it. They got everything wrong. At one point, they were even selling books about at 10% above RRP. The stickers actually had the RRP on it, and the price was 10% more. There are many great essays on why Borders failed in the US, and almost all of those reasons are replicated in Australia. They didn't have an e-strategy. They didn't understand the market. They invested too much in retail leasing. So to be fair to Senator Sherry, we've just seen a total collapse and fire sale of our oldest book chain, our most distinguished publisher, and perhaps 25% of the retailing footprint just disappeared. So other things that were possibly weighing on Senator Sherry, and you said this, was that online sales were already being dominated by Book Depository and our own startup, Booktopia. Book Depository were and still are offering free shipping from the UK. Ebooks were seemingly going to kill the book industry with new distribution channels, devices, and formats. Bookstores were in a state of panic about what E was going to do. Independent bookstores didn't know how they could participate. Could they somehow capture or reclaim their customers? Australia is a very highly urbanised population that is an extreme rapid adopter of change and new technology. We are one of the fastest English-speaking countries to take up any new technology, with the exception of climate change, but we're getting there. There was the possibility that Amazon would arrive any day. In fact, they bought the Book Depository that same year, so arrived by stealth. And there was a real assumption that because the economy was inching along, there really wasn't enough in it to sustain entrepreneurs to open new businesses and fill the gap. And I think also Senator Sherry also misunderstood the long tail nature of what Amazon's business model really was. Specialty stores are probably, in my view, the hardest hit by Amazon's business model rather than general bookstores. General bookstores can negotiate and deal with their local community. They can deal with people who need a gift for tomorrow. They can deal with the kids for what they need for school. Specialty stores have an ethereal community that sometimes is physically local, but often is a much broader community, and Amazon will be able to always offer 100% of what's available, and a specialty store can only curate what they can physically fit into a bookstore. So what actually happened after this? Well, after we all gnashed our teeth, cried, had a cathartic experience, authors just kept writing. Publishers kept publishing and printing, and booksellers kept selling books. But sales were down and kept going down. Confidence was down. We were flat. There was a real fear that there was some truth to all of this. Once we got over the initial outrage, we began a debate about what bookselling should be. And this became the standard debate, I think, that's in all of the Western nations. Are books and bookstores cultural custodians and cultural altars? And the economic rationalists who say it's a small business, it doesn't matter. The market will win out, and consumers, it's the most important thing. The good thing about this debate going on is that it's given a vocabulary and a message for independent bookselling, and for publishers to stand behind, for authors to stand behind, and for these groups to make an argument to government. On the other side, government just said, it's economic rationalism. We don't care. Figure it out yourself. We'll get there. So no one really cut through with government. No one really cut through at the high level. But with independent communities, this message that bookstores were culturally important, that they were there for communities, defined many bookstores and allowed booksellers to negotiate and engage with their communities. It also encouraged local publishers to actually support cultural activity. And publishers had retreated from a view of it's all about the money and margin to be, we're all in this together. I'm just trying to skim ahead. So the cultural icon argument continues to dominate what independent bookstores do and what the ABA does for its members. I think this is what Merrill was showing slides earlier, and I think this is what the ABA in America does for independent bookselling there. And it resonates particularly well, and it seems to work. But there is, and there always will be, a slow leakage from in-store to online whenever books are unavailable locally for supply chain issues. Although ironically, the pandemic and the supply chain issues we now face, because they are economy-wide, not just books, mean that many Australian consumers are much more aware of the importance of local retail and supporting local retail. And so local in-store sales are on the rise, even if they aren't necessarily the latest book that's about to be published or something that someone has special ordered. So our communities are getting behind us. Total Australian sales fell from their apex in 2010 and dropped to about $1 billion by 2014. So we lost about 30% by value. From 2014 to 2020, sales remained static, but reduced in real value because of inflation. So print sales fell by as much as 30%. And why is that? Well, because some of the public just believed the suggestion that Nick Sherry had made. Bad news is repeated more often than not. Good news is always the hardest story to sell. Every bookseller in Australia will tell you a story of customers coming in even today and telling you, oh, it's lovely, you're still here. Booksellers are dying. I haven't been in one for years. They don't buy a book, but they love to tell you that it's good that you're there. Thankfully, that seems to be dying out, but it was a real problem for a long time. So the ABA and its members decided we needed a narrative to push back on this. We needed to convince people that books were real, they were here, they were going to stay, bookselling and local bookstores were important. Now, the other thing is that there is always a segment of the market who will always be, it's about the cheapest. There's nothing about a relationship with the vendor who's giving you whatever goods. You're just going to buy cheapest. Whatever is the least resistance to getting your desires filled is going to be where you go. And many of those consumers, I think, find online their market. And we'll never get them back because they don't have to engage emotionally. They get the cheap price they want. They get the instant satisfaction because they've clicked the buy button. They might have to wait 6 weeks for it to arrive. And it's going to come from the same shed that I would have special ordered it from, but they're satisfied. Every secondhand bookseller will tell you that Book Depository and Booktopia, Bookmarks, Amazon and ABA packing slips are now in every third or fourth book that you buy secondhand. There's a lot of it out there. Retail is tough in Australia and economic margins have been reducing for some time. We worried about ebooks for a little while. Unless you sell romance or procedural crime, it's not a problem anymore. Audiobooks were a real problem. There was a significant part of the market for most general booksellers. As soon as CDs were removed from the equation, Audible had the streaming rights, they died. So that disappeared. Book Depository were increasingly aggressive about getting into the market with free shipping. Now, there's a whole nother story about that, but they get their books into Australia for the cost of a letter. So we can't compete on shipping and they beat the publishers. Our response to that was we would try and get books to Australia faster. So until the pandemic, we had there was a pact between the ABA and the APA to increase speed to market. I'll try and bring this all together in one lot. So the response, how did Australian bookselling survive? The first thing was retail just abhors a vacuum. entrepreneurs and existing booksellers just stood up to the plate. It took until 2014 and 16 for that to happen and for there to be enough confidence that the bottom hadn't fallen out of the market. But we've added something like 15% to the bottom line of the number of stores that are available. Whole new chains have opened up with 20 and 30 stores. Small chains in one state have become national. Not all of the stores in the Angus and Robertson collapsed actually disappeared. They just reinvented themselves after a significant period. The publishers got behind us. There's a free service for booksellers, online price and availability service, which takes out the cost of global books in print or your Bowker subscription. And it's better and it's real time and you can get a data feed straight into your POS or your online. The publishers have been supportive of that for a significant amount of time. The ABA had a number of things. There was a PR campaign to affirm bookselling. There was a whole process of lobbying with politicians. There was a soft public campaign around posters. We established Love Your Bookshop Day. Now, I think each of the English-speaking world's jurisdictions has one of those now. We started that. We stole it from National Indie Record Store Day in the US. They were quite chuffed. And that has been a signature point of the year where we do engage and get journalists, politicians, publishers, authors, etc., all to engage just with bookstores. There's special books come out. And I think everyone is now feeding off that. It's a really good community between the ABA, the BA, and all the English language bookselling associations.
Can we just end on what is actually a lovely positive note?
On a positive note, yeah, right to the end. So, sorry, I love talking about bookstores. Yeah, praise. At the time. So the good news is that realistically, bookselling is alive in Australia. We have some significant structural problems, but the tyranny of distance has protected us and will continue to protect us for some time. We've made significant advances in dealing with the structural problems we have around unfair playing field, around tax, about shipping into Australia, etc. And COVID has given actually the book industry a great boost in a weird way because people couldn't get books shipped in from overseas. Australia was locked down. We had a very tight series of restrictions and it meant that people retreated to community, retreated to bookstores, and bookstore sales are going up. Book sales this year are now at the third highest they've ever been. They're at $1.3 billion, and we've seen an increase in average selling prices up 3.5%. Discounting is down 4%, which means more profit for everyone. Backlist sales have continued to grow by 15 to 20%, which allows bookstores to curate and specialise. Adult fiction increased by 7%, and all genres showed either growth or... Anecdotally, booksellers are more positive. We've seen probably 20 to 30 new independent booksellers just pop up to do small things in country towns. We have lots of challenges, but we actually have an invigorated industry that are doing positive things. And the best thing that's come out of all of this is, I think I just mentioned it before, but I'll repeat it. The CEO of the ABA will be at the BA conference. Meryl was at our conference last year. Oren Teacher reached out to Australia. The Australians and the British and the Americans are collaborating on all of these issues. And every time a good idea appears somewhere to sustain bookselling, it's instantly shared. So I think the future is bright and there is every reason to get into bookselling. Just don't ask for the detail because I'll go over time. Thank you for listening.
We've run out of time, so what I'm going to suggest is I'm sure folk will have questions for both Gail and Tim. So if you type them into the chat, then we can have a record, or those of you who are in the room, if you let me... Oh, right, sorry. If you type questions into the chat, they will be recorded and they will be passed to Tim and to Gail. And anybody's in the room, if they let Sam or Eben know, we can share the questions around. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to the organisers now to close the. Yeah.
Sorry.
Right. Can everybody online see and hear Eben and me? Yes, thank you, Gail. Well, just very, very briefly, we just want to thank everybody for supporting this as a network and as an idea. As you can tell, we could have had twice as long. To those of you online, we did eat lunch really, really fast to get back to the discussion. Already over lunch, there's some suggestions of maybe doing this as an annual thing. Suggestions of places like Bristol, York, London for the next one. But obviously, if anyone else has got any ideas for places, get in touch. Melbourne, you know, Hawaii, you know, we're open to any suggestions. We've had a good international mix of papers, so it could be anywhere in the world next time. Eben,
we also wanted that this past year we had several fully online seminars, and we want to repeat that again this year. We're hoping to do every other month starting in November. So it'll be November, January, March, May, there we go. And then take a break over the summer. So if people have thoughts for panels they would like to do or to attend, please get in touch, because we'd like to put together a schedule fairly soon with some ideas, so people can start planning. Yeah.
That would be fantastic. And then we can continue building the network over the next year, and then hopefully have another conference at some point. But
thank you to everyone who managed to get to Hay, survive rain and whatnot. Thank you to everyone who was patient with any technological issues. And I need to give a special thank you to Sophie, without whom none of this would have happened. I think everyone here, online or off, has been in touch with Sophie over the last few months. So thank you very much.